There are people spending thousands of dollars a month on their health, hormones, peptides, weight loss medications, IV therapy, and they're still exhausted, still inflamed, still not seeing results. Because the same treatment in two different people can produce two completely different outcomes. Not because the treatment is wrong, because the conditions inside the body that determine whether it works were never addressed. Most health programs never go there. That changes today. Welcome back to the RESPIRA Series. My name is Dr. Carlos Torres, specialist in otolaryngology, sleep medicine, and obesity medicine. And I'm here with Dr. Diego Rutenberg, specialist in functional medicine. And today we're going to be talking about something very interesting, which is why people, despite the fact that they're following all the recommendations from their doctor, trying to eat the proper nutrition, sleep as much as they can, still feel tired. And why even some people are taking medications and those medications don't seem to be working like it does in some other people. So Diego, welcome, and welcome to our second episode of the RESPIRA series.
Thank you for having me, and exciting to dive into this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which we see in completely different ways sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm sure that you see this a lot more than I do, because many people that go to your clinic, they've been to a million different doctors before, traditional medicine specialists, and they haven't found a solution to the symptoms that they have. What have you felt or have you seen that are some of the most common issues that most of these patients have?
Well, usually there are patterns, you know, and now more than before, people seek a functional medicine physician opinion when they have seen already many specialists, you know, from ENTs to general practitioners, endocrinology.
It happens to me a lot. Yes. It happens particularly in the field of sleep. I see a lot of patients that come to me because they're tired, they're fatigued, and they think that sleep is the problem. You know, they narrow it down to only being a sleep problem. And then you conduct an exam, you do a sleep test, and everything seems to be normal. Even people with very mild, in some cases, mild sleep apnea, they're extremely symptomatic, and you really don't have an explanation for that. You know?
Yeah, and the patterns are, it's always stop a little bit, pause the conversation and try to listen to the patient first. You know? I always say that, you know, but and then try to make a retrospective of how the onset of the condition came to be. It's not the same if someone, let's say, is not sleeping, but he was sleeping perfectly, and I don't know, they went to a trip abroad and they came back and their sleeping patterns have changed.
Yeah.
Or if someone has not been sleeping since childhood, you know. So I think all those questions that always give you different perceptions of the pattern differentiation that we're trying to find.
Absolutely.
You know? And then we try to start digging into different systems and how the system interconnect.
You know? And like I explained to many of these patients, you know, what we're trying to do here, you know, when we're treating any sleep disorder that they might have, is to rule that out of the equation. You know, you're coming with fatigue with, you know, has many potential causes, from stress to your nutrition, your level of activity, you know, many different things. Sleep might be one of those components where we're trying, you know, by treating that disorder, we're trying to take it out of the equations to see if that is the main reason. But if you still continue having symptoms, we really need to dig a little bit deeper to try to understand what the cause is. And many of the issues that maybe even lead to that sleep problem, for example, sleep apnea, because they might have gained weight, or because of their breathing, you know, there are many that might have been the root cause, you know, of the symptoms that they have, you know, and not necessarily the sleep disorder itself.
Many times there are questions that have been avoided or not done. For example, we always inquire about nutrition, physical activity. For example, relationships sometimes are toxic. A relationship or relationships or stress factors, work, etc. are very important. But then when you go into kind of physiology, you have to start digging deep into other aspects that are usually avoided. Of course, gastrointestinal health is always one main topic of conversation in the functional medicine office.
Absolutely. Now, I want to challenge you with something, a concept that in the past has been discussed. I think there are some mixed opinions regarding this, but we all know in the field of medicine, when we have a very sick patient, we have patients, for example, that are in the ICU that develop a very severe infection, for example, or that have, respiratory problems and respiratory failure. One of the first things that physiologically gets affected is their pH balance. Okay. Now, these are extreme cases. These are people that are extremely sick, but we see how the degradation of that balance, of that acid-base balance in their body, then leads to a lot of other processes that many times can be even fatal for the patient. What are some of the early signs that somebody might be out of balance? And what importance do you think that has in setting up the right environment for people to be healthy?
You know that in my studies, I read books and studies about dietary models and diets in particular, fat diets, and there is a type of diet that is an alkaline diet, which refers to pH, but in many cases have been debunked, meaning that many people state that even though when you read about what this diet is all about, and that it pushes for alkalinization and foods that they drive a more alkaline state in the body, many studies have been put in doubt. But when you came to this approach, I was like, wait a second. And there is something that we use a lot in the diagnosis process that we call low-grade inflammation. Many people come to see us and their labs are okay, and there is nothing in the manifestation of the biochemistry or even in the gastrointestinal system that is not telling us that there is an inflammatory distress. And we see little flicks in different parts of the biochemistry, or the gastrointestinal system, but the concept of a low-grade pH imbalance is something that is fascinating now. And I want you to, explain it to me.
So for me, this whole concept really, after years in medicine and seeing many sick patients, I understood that pH, was always maintaining the right pH was always something important in patients, particularly, when I saw patients that were very sick, that's something that we always pay very close attention to. And I understand that the body has two main mechanisms to maintain that pH balance, right? There's a metabolic mechanism, mainly through how our kidneys are working in order to serve as a buffer to any changes in the acid-base balance that there is in the body. And there's also a respiratory one, right? When somebody, for example, becomes more acidotic, that goes more into an acid state, okay? One of the first mechanisms that they have is to start hyperventilating and breathing extremely quickly to get rid of carbon dioxide, which is acidic, okay? Now, putting all one and one together, okay, one of the first things that I started to realize is that, there could be something here from a breathing standpoint, right? How can somebody that is in an acidotic state or low-grade acidosis, how might that contribute to conditions like sleep apnea, for example? And one of the things through my research that I started to understand is that most people really don't know how to breathe, and they're constantly in a state of hyperventilation, maybe not to the level of somebody that is in respiratory failure, but there's a lot of people that are mouth breathers, and that mouth breathing causes several things, right? First of all, it doesn't allow for the lungs to expand the way that they're supposed to some degree. That affects the exchange of gases.
That it comes to me that I was reading that I think it was in the past century or in the 1800s, 90% of the United States population were farmers. And I think in Europe too.
They were what? I'm sorry?
Farmers.
Okay.
Farmers. So as a farmer, you need to work.
Yes.
And you need to lift weights, meaning that the inactivity, the activity. Why? Because I like to lift weights. So
we can tell.
Yeah, but when you lift weights, you have to educate your breathing.
Yeah.
I mean, and it becomes almost second nature when you go for a run or you start lifting weights. You have to isolate the core, you have to protect your spine, and you have to improve that. And how desk work and and sedentary actions are leading people are not to breathe correctly.
Yeah.
Because it seems counterintuitive that people don't know how to breathe, but in a way, it's almost like the daily lifestyle
Absolutely.
are driving them not to breathe correctly because they don't need to do it.
There's no need, to optimize the breathing, right? Because their work and what they do is so sedentary that there's no really a necessity, for more air. But going back to what I was saying before, that compensation that happens through breathing, right? Because of that, what you were explaining, many people are not breathing properly, can lead patients to not being breathing optimally. So that definitely has an impact on the acid base. So, as I started digging more and more, one of the things that becomes confusing is that rarely in a healthy person like the one that you see in your clinic or I see in my clinic, they're out of balance. If you do a blood test on them, you're going to see that their pH is normal, right? And that's because the body has the ability to tightly regulate that pH because it's so important for all the chemical processes that are happening in our body to have the right pH that the body is willing to sacrifice anything, in order to keep that at an optimal level. I compare it to, there are people, we always have mechanisms in our body to compensate for deficiencies, okay? Whenever the oxygen drops down a little bit, what happens? The blood pressure increases, the heart starts working more to compensate and continue delivering the amount of oxygen that the organs need. And the organs continue working normally, but there's a compensation process going on that is not optimal and is having a toll on the body. So with the pH, I see it the same way, right? In order to maintain that physiological pH, our body might be carrying functions, that are not optimal for our health.
And how you're telling your patients to control it?
Well, that's something that we're gonna discuss, in more detail in this conversation. But one of the things that I wanted to set that I think is very important, for the discussion that we're having in this particular episode, is how that environment, how that pH lack of balance, for lack of a better word, of the pH might impact other things for the way our body functions. And not only the way our body functions, but the way that our body responds to treatments, okay? And we understand that, for example, hormones, peptides, that are naturally produced in our bodies, the way that they interact with the receptors and the processes that they are activating might be affected by those low acid, acidic levels that a person might have, so, and that might be the start of many other processes, right? So pH, in my opinion, is one of those missing links that we're not paying too much attention to it. And people may be discouraged looking into the pH because the reality is that there's not a good test to measure your pH. Any regular lab work, they're all kind of like indexes, that give us an idea of in what state we are, but there's not like a real test to measure that. But we understand,
fascinating.
But we understand the different processes and different things that help keep a natural pH, a normal pH, without putting our body under so much stress. And I think that is really the foundation that we need to start looking into and understanding in order to optimize not only how our body works, but when we need additional help, with medications and everything else, to make sure that those treatments are going to be effective. So, I mean, now that we put together this program, our Respira Wellness Program, how do you see that some of those elements that we have discussed, come into play?
I mean, it is the whole palette of interventions that are going to allow us give our patients the total solution for restoration.
Absolutely.
You were talking about more like the technical part. I was thinking about food. I was thinking about posture. I was thinking about things that there are more in the realm of my practice.
Yeah.
And integrating both, I think it is a win-win.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think that through your experience and my own experience, we have been able to combine in this program, the key elements that we think are the ones that are the most important in helping someone have a normal, well-controlled physiological pH balance and acid-base balance. So this has been a great conversation, Diego. During our next episodes, we're going to be discussing each one of these components in detail and what are some of the best ways to optimize these functions in our body.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here.
Yeah.